It started with the crunch of gravel outside my ranch gate. I was in the barn, brushing down Pepper, my prized miniature horse, when I heard it, the unmistakable scrape of tires rolling in slow and deliberate. My heart skipped. I wasn't expecting anyone, especially not her. Karen. She rolled up in her usual manner, like she owned not just her little square of HOA property, but the entire county. I could see the glint of her aviator sunglasses from across the field, like two sharp knives, glinting in the sun. Her posture, as always, was stiff, spine straight, nose tilted slightly upward, like she was always smelling something foul. Probably freedom. I didn't wave. I didn't walk over. I kept brushing Pepper, but I watched her. I always had to watch. Her, Karen, was the president of our HOA, an organization I never voted for, never wanted, and definitely never respected. The ranch sat right outside the edge of the subdivision, technically not under her jurisdiction, but Karen had ideas, big ones, and she believed boundaries were suggestions. She pulled up to the edge of the fence and stood there with her clipboard, tapping it like a metronome of doom. I didn't approach. She didn't ask to come in. She just stood there, watching, like some hawk in activewear. That was last week. This morning I found the gate to the north pasture wide open. I froze. Pepper wasn't in the corral. My breath caught. My boots thudded against the packed dirt as I sprinted out, heart pounding, voice cracking as I shouted his name. "Pepper! Pepper, boy!" No answer. Then I heard the shot. A single, distant rifle crack that split the silence like lightning through dry wood. I didn't think. I ran, across the fields, through the tree line, my boots catching in brush, my shirt snagging on branches. The sound had come from the west edge of my property, near the ridge, the place where the fence line had been, recently trimmed by a contractor Karen had hired without my permission. She claimed it was beautification. I knew better. I burst through the trees, and my legs gave out. Pepper lay still, tiny hooves curled under his delicate frame. His coat, dappled silver and white, was marred with red. I stumbled to him, dropping to my knees. He was still warm. I whispered his name, touched his cheek. Nothing. Then I heard laughter. Distant, male, foreign, hunters. I turned slowly, rage crawling up my spine like fire ants. That fence hadn't just been trimmed, it had been opened. On purpose. Karen, my mind, reeled. HOA bylaws, property lines, permissions, hunting rights. None of it mattered now. I walked back to the house in a fog, the sunset bleeding across the hills like a wound. As I approached the gate, I saw her again, standing there, sipping from a thermos, watching. She didn't flinch when I approached. Didn't blink. Just stood there like she'd been waiting for me to return, like the whole thing was unfolding exactly how she imagined it. "Afternoon," she said flatly, like we were passing at the farmer's market, like my world hadn't just cracked in half. I stopped on my side of the fence, fists clenched so tight my nails bit into my palms. "You left the gate open." Karen raised an eyebrow, one corner of her lip curling in mock confusion. "Excuse me?" "The north gate," I snapped. "The one you had trimmed. It was wide open. You let people in." She glanced toward the ridge, taking a sip from her thermos. "Oh, that gate. Well, a few of the gentlemen from the hunting club asked about access. They were interested in helping with the coyote population, said it was getting out of control." "They shot Pepper, Karen." Her eyes flicked back to me, still no shock. No guilt, just a flash of annoyance, like I was inconveniencing her. "That little thing," she said. "I thought it was a goat or something. Honestly, you really shouldn't have livestock roaming so close to hunting areas." The words hit like a shovel to the chest. "You knew what he was," I growled, stepping closer to the fence. "He was registered, trained, mine. You've seen me ride him in parades. You've seen him every day for the last 3 years. Karen shrugged, taking another sip. "Well, that's unfortunate. But you know, if you had just attended the HOA safety meetings, we might have coordinated all this better. Hunters have rights, too." That was when I saw it, tucked in her clipboard. A map, my property, sectioned, marked. There were flags on the borders, colored dots, and lines sketched in red ink. Her thermos wasn't the only thing she'd brought. I lunged. The fence stopped me. My hands hit the wood, hard, rattling the gate in its frame. Karen stepped back only slightly, as if even now she didn't believe I could cross into her world. The world of petty rules and power plays and fake smiles behind lawsuits. "You trespassed," I said, voice shaking with fury. "You invited armed strangers onto my land. That's criminal. You understand that, right?" Karen pursed her lips and looked over her glasses, like a librarian lecturing a child. "That's your version of events. I'm sure the board would see it differently, especially considering your recent resistance to community guidelines." I stared at her, mind racing. She was serious. She was smirking. This wasn't just about Pepper. This had been building. The complaints about my barn being too rustic, the letters about my flags, the citations for the solar panels I installed. Without proper aesthetic review, it was all leading to this. A push. A test. She thought I'd break, but something inside me had already snapped. I stepped back, slow and calm, never taking my eyes off her. "Get off my land, Karen." "Oh, I'm not on it," she said with a sugary smile. "Not technically. I'm standing right here, within HOA bounds." She turned like she was done, like the conversation had ended on her terms. She started back toward her SUV, clipboard tucked under her arm, like a prize. I watched her go, and then I looked at that map. The way it stuck out slightly, just enough to catch the wind. The next move was already forming in my head. Karen didn't know it yet, but the game had changed, and I wasn't playing by her rules anymore. That night, I couldn't sleep. Pepper's halter still hung on the barn wall, and every time the wind stirred the trees, I imagined the jingle of his bell collar. The corral was too quiet, the barn too still. I sat on the porch with a thermos of my own, black coffee gone cold, staring at the gate where she had stood, smug and certain. Her words echoed over and over. That little thing? She didn't just kill Pepper, she erased him, reduced him to a footnote in a HOA complaint, a line item in her petty war for control. I couldn't let it go. Not now. Not after this. By morning, I had a plan. I pulled every document I had, deed, plat map, topographic survey, trail permits, the lot. Spread them across my kitchen table like a general mapping a battlefield. I marked every place Karen had overstepped. The ridge fence, the path through the south orchard she'd claimed as a shared trail, the runoff ditch she'd redirected last summer without asking. Then I marked the north gate, the spot where she gave access to hunters, trespassers, with no permission, no notification, no right. It wasn't about lawsuits anymore. It wasn't about HOA letters or community meetings. This was about drawing a line, my land, my rules. So I started building, not just a new fence, a wall, tall, steel reinforced, anchored in concrete, cameras at the corners, motion sensors, solar-powered floodlights. I called in deliveries from town, took 2 days off from everything else, and worked straight through the storm that rolled in on the third day. Karen showed up on the fourth. She stood on the dirt road, hands on her hips, sunglasses pushed up like she was about to inspect a crime scene. Her mouth curled at the sight of the wall. "You can't build that without board approval," she shouted, trying to be heard over the sound of my drill. I didn't answer, just kept working. "This is a clear violation of the visibility and design ordinances. It's obstructive." Still didn't answer. She stomped closer, close enough to shout directly at me. "You're in violation of Code 14B, subsection 6. No visual obstructions over 5 feet within shared zones of community aesthetic alignment." I shut off the drill and turned to face her, arms crossed. "Funny," I said. "I don't remember your HOA paying taxes on my land." Her eyes narrowed. "It affects property values. You should have thought about that before you let armed men on my ranch and got my horse killed." She didn't like that. Not one bit. Her jaw tensed, and I could see the thin thread of control she kept over herself begin to fray. "That was an unfortunate misunderstanding," she said sharply. But I'm warning you, if you don't remove that wall by the end of the week, we'll escalate. I smiled, slow and deliberate. Go ahead. Her silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned and marched back to her car, typing furiously on her phone. I went back to the wall. 2 more panels went up that day. Reinforced, welded, permanent. I didn't care what board meetings she called. I didn't care what letters she sent, because Karen had made one mistake too many. She crossed into my life, drew blood, and thought she could walk away with a smirk. But I wasn't just defending my land anymore. I was taking everything back, one bolt, one brick, one buried HOA ordinance at a time. 3 days later, the letter came, thick, embossed, self-important, hand-delivered, not mailed, because of course it was. HOA official stationery, signed in blue ink with that signature of hers, large, loopy, like it was drawn with a feathered quill and a gallon of entitlement. Notice of violation, immediate compliance required. It was laughable. I'd seen more legally binding napkins at the local bar. She had highlighted the section that demanded I remove unauthorized constructions interfering with shared line-of-sight zoning cohesion, as if her suburban buzzwords meant anything out here, where the coyotes still outnumbered her votes. Tossed it onto the fire pit without a word. Watched the corners curl and blacken, the HOA seal bubbling into ash. The next day, she brought company. Karen stood at the end of the road again, this time with a man in a beige windbreaker, clipboard, in hand. He didn't come onto the land. He just took notes, nodded politely, and stayed well behind the fence line. Smart man. Karen did all the talking, of course, pointing, gesturing, occasionally pausing to throw dramatic looks in my direction like I was a criminal under federal investigation for putting up a damn fence on my own land. I didn't give them the satisfaction of looking twice, but that night, just after midnight, I heard something, a click, metal against metal. I slipped out of bed, grabbed the shotgun from the rack by the door, not loaded, not yet, and eased onto the porch. The moon lit up the fields in a dull silver glow. Everything was still. Quiet, except for one thing. Phileum, North Gate. It was swinging open. I crept closer, boots silent on the dirt, heart pounding with a quiet fury. There she was, Karen, on my property, again, holding bolt cutters. She froze when she saw me, a beat too long, then suddenly, all innocence. Oh, I thought this was... I had a report that the gate was unlocked. I came to check. You brought bolt cutters, Karen. She tried to hide them behind her back, like I hadn't already seen, like we weren't standing 10 feet apart with the moon shining down like a spotlight on her HOA infrared crime. This is trespassing, I said calmly, and attempted destruction of private property. I've got the whole thing on camera. Her face twisted, the mask slipping. You can't do this. You can't just shut us out. This land was meant to be part of the community. It's my land. It's everyone's concern, she hissed. You think you can just sit up here, building walls, ignoring the rules? You think that fence changes anything? I stepped forward, slow, deliberate, voice low and steady. That fence isn't to keep you out, Karen. It's to remind you where you end and I begin. For a moment she didn't say a word. Then her eyes flicked toward the small blinking red light on the fence post, one of the new cameras. She turned without another word and disappeared into the dark bolt cutters still clutched in her manicured hands. The next morning I uploaded the footage, sent it to the sheriff's office with a report of criminal trespassing, made a copy for my lawyer, and then I made sure a copy found its way to the HOA email thread. By noon, my inbox exploded. Half the board was panicking, half was pretending nothing happened. But Karen was silent. Too silent. And that's what worried me, because people like her don't stop when they're caught. They double down. And I knew deep down that she hadn't just come to cut a lock. She'd come to send a message. But she had no idea. I was already writing the next chapter. It was 3 mornings later when I noticed the drone, buzzing low over the orchard, skimming the treetops like a curious wasp. It hovered over the barn for a full minute, just long enough to make a slow, lazy pass over the corral where Pepper used to play, then banked sharply toward the southern boundary of the property. Karen sighed. I followed it with my eyes, coffee. Mug frozen halfway to my lips. She was watching me now. She didn't even care to hide it. Later that day, I found a fresh set of tire tracks near the edge of the property, ruts too wide and too clean to be from my truck. They curved in from the service road and pulled up dangerously close to the newly built wall before turning back out. I checked the footage from the motion sensor cameras. 3:14 a.m. Headlights. A lone figure stepping out, pacing along the fence. Short, slouched, sunglasses. At 3 in the damn morning. Karen? She was escalating, so I escalated too. I reinforced the entire perimeter. Put in steel posts every 10 feet. Double-wired the top with no-climb mesh. I reprogrammed the motion sensors to trigger audible warnings when crossed. Installed trail cams in the trees. By the end of the week, my ranch looked less like a ranch and more like a Cold War outpost. And yet, despite all that, I knew the war wasn't going to be fought with fences and cameras alone. Karen was moving differently now. Quieter, strategic. She'd dropped the pretense of board meetings and open letters. The HOA inbox was suddenly scrubbed clean. No new updates, no announcements, no Karen's Corner in the weekly bulletin where she'd normally dictated landscaping tones and acceptable mailbox colors. She was planning something, and I got my first glimpse of it the following Tuesday. A plain manila envelope arrived. No name, no return address, just taped to my mailbox like a warning. I opened it there on the gravel road, dirt dusting the corners of the paper. Inside was a stack of printed pages, meeting minutes, from an HOA board vote I was never informed about. Motion. To rezone buffer property between residential parcels and adjacent agricultural land. Passed. 4-0 date, backdated to a week before Pepper was shot. Signatures. Karen and 3 others I'd never met. There in print was the justification she needed. It was technical, buried in legalese, but I read it twice. The HOA had reclaimed a 20-yard buffer zone that extended into my land, citing outdated land use records from before I purchased the ranch. It wasn't legal, it wasn't binding, but it was intentional. She was trying to make a paper trail, a fake one, a way to say that I had no right to defend what was mine, that I'd built a wall on land she had already rewritten history to claim. Stood there in the dust, heart pounding, jaw clenched so tight I thought my molars might crack. This wasn't just about Pepper anymore. It wasn't about fences or bylaws or drone flyovers. This was war. A quiet, ugly war, where smiles hid knives, and signatures replaced bullets, and Karen had just fired the next shot. But she'd made a mistake. She thought I'd fight her in meetings, in hearings, in the narrow, slow confines of her HOA rulebook. She didn't know I had a plan of my own, one she couldn't control, couldn't rewrite, and couldn't see coming. She wanted to redraw lines on paper? Fine, I was about to redraw the map. I spent the next 2 days in the county recorder's office. Everyone there knew Karen, not because she was liked, God. No, but because she never stopped filing. Zoning this. Noise complaint that. Disputes over tree lines and mailbox heights and unregistered decorative bird baths. Her name was stamped across more forms than the county commissioners. But what she didn't know, and what I confirmed after hours of combing through dusty archives and microfilm files, was this. Her buffer zone didn't exist. Not legally. Not technically. Not anywhere. It was a fabrication based on a land use proposal from the 1980s that had never been approved. A draft. A suggestion. The kind of thing written up during a drought year and then left to rot in a drawer once the rains came back, and the farming contracts resumed. The only reason that line even showed up on some maps was because Karen had submitted it herself as an update request to the HOA zoning committee. And like everything else she touched, it got rubber stamped without a second glance by her hand-picked board of yes men. But legally, my land was whole, no easement, no buffer, no shared zone, mine. Every inch. I walked out of that office with a certified copy of the original land plat, a sworn affidavit from a retired county surveyor, and a notarized statement from the current land records officer. It was time to take the fight to her doorstep. I didn't go to the next HOA meeting. I hosted it on my porch. One by one, I invited the board members personally, not with paper invitations. No. I showed up in person. I shook hands. I explained. I offered lemonade and a chance to walk the fence line with me to see the land for what it really was. Out of 6, 4 showed up. The same 4 who had supposedly voted yes on the buffer zone resolution. None of them had a clue what I was talking about. Turns out, Karen had signed for them. Forgery. And worse, she'd attached. Minutes from a meeting that never happened. I didn't yell. Didn't curse. I let them see the papers, the signatures, the dated county maps. I handed out copies of my certified records like they were church pamphlets. By the end of the evening, I had all 4 signatures on a formal statement rescinding the zoning change. Legally, she was cornered, but I wasn't done yet, because that was just the paper war. There was still the matter of Pepper, of the hunters, of the bolt cutters in the night, and the drone buzzing above my barn like a vulture. That was going to require something a little more visible. So I made a sign, 8 feet wide, 4 feet tall, custom painted. I mounted it on the fence at the north gate, right where the hunters had crossed, right where Karen had smiled like none of it mattered. The words were simple: private property. No trespassing, under 24/7 surveillance. Trespassers will be prosecuted, especially Karen. By noon she was at my gate again. No sunglasses, no clipboard. Just fury barely contained behind a forced smile. "Remove it," she hissed. "It's accurate," I said, sipping from a fresh mug of black coffee. "Every word. It's defamatory. It's documented. You want to test that in court?" For once, she had no comeback, just silence, and the beginning of something she never showed before. Not outrage, not control, but fear. Not because I was dangerous, but because she knew I had finally stepped out of her system, out of her HOA shackles, and into something bigger, something she couldn't manipulate. I let the silence stretch until she turned and walked back to her car, stiff and mechanical, but I knew she wouldn't stop. People like Karen never do. So I started building again. Not a wall this time, something else, something bigger. And I knew, without a doubt, the moment she found out what it was, she'd come running. The rumble of heavy machinery started the next morning. Karen was the first to notice. She always was. Her porch, with its over-pruned rose bushes and overpriced patio, set, had a clear line of sight to the lower pasture and to the convoy of flatbeds and gravel trucks rolling up my drive. Dust kicked up in thick clouds as the crew unloaded fencing material, lumber, steel girders, and something she hadn't seen on this land before, a foundation rig. I stood with my arms crossed at the edge of the field as they started digging. The noise echoed across the ridge. Post-hole augers punched deep into the soil. Stakes marked the outline of something large, rectangular, and permanent. Karen stood at her gate, slack-jawed, her phone already in hand. I could see her fingers flying, probably texting the board, the sheriff, the mayor, who knows. But she couldn't do a thing, and she knew it. Because what I was building didn't break a single law. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a shed. It was something she had no jurisdiction over, not under HOA rules, not under local zoning ordinances. It was a barn, but not just any barn. It was a memorial, a tribute to Pepper, to what she destroyed. At the front of it, there'd be a custom-welded steel sculpture of a miniature horse in a full gallop. Inside, the floor would be smooth-finished hardwood, the walls lined with photos, memorabilia, awards, and, most importantly, evidence. Framed copies of her forged HOA vote, still images of the drone, the trail cam footage of her with bolt cutters. A quiet, immovable reminder of what she'd done and what she tried to cover up. And, right in the center, beneath a skylight, I was. Going to install Pepper's halter, still stained with the dirt from the day he died. I saw her storm down the road not 5 minutes later, her heels clacking across the gravel like gunshots. She didn't even bother with her usual passive-aggressive. "Pleasantries, what is this?" she snapped. "Construction," I said, not even looking up. "You can't just build a structure like this. There's protocol, community aesthetics, board oversight. This isn't within the HOA's control. Agricultural outbuildings are exempt under County Land Use Code, Section 33C. "You're lying. File the paperwork and find out." She stood there, red-faced and furious, glaring at the crew like she could will them into disappearing. But they kept working, oblivious. One of the workers even waved at her. I almost laughed. "You're obsessed with control, Karen," I said, finally meeting her eyes. "But here's the thing, you never had it. You just scared everyone into believing you did." She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised a hand. Pepper was trained to trust people. "To come when called. You gave hunters access to my land. You made him a target. Then you tried to erase what happened with signatures and fake paperwork." Her mouth clamped shut. "I'm not building this for revenge," I said. "I'm building it so no one ever forgets what you did." For a moment she looked uncertain. Not guilty, no, she wasn't capable of that. But shaken. Like she finally understood this wasn't going to blow over. There wouldn't be a meeting to smooth it out. No resolution she could sneak onto a ballot. This barn was going to stand, and every time she looked out her window, every time a prospective buyer asked what that building was, just beyond the trees, she'd be forced to remember. She turned without another word and walked back to her house. But I knew she wasn't done. Karen was a scorched earth type, and when someone like her realizes she's lost the field, she goes after the fire. That night I didn't sleep. I stayed by the window with my shotgun in arm's reach, watching the fence line, the barn's skeletal frame lit faintly by the moon, waiting, because Karen hadn't just started a war. She'd made it personal, and I had a feeling. The real fight hadn't even started yet. The first spark came 2 nights later, not literal yet, but close. Was checking the new motion-triggered floodlights around the north end of the barn site when the sensor tripped. A soft click, then a blinding glare lit up the field like daylight. I ducked behind a water tank and scanned the perimeter. Movement. Right at the edge of the tree line, it was fast, too fast for an animal, but not fast enough to outrun the camera perched on the pole just 20 feet away. I reviewed the footage on my phone seconds later, and there she was, again, Karen, dressed in black this time. Hoodie pulled tight over her head, a flashlight in one hand, something heavy in the other. It looked like a gas can. I didn't breathe, didn't blink. She had gone too far already, trespassing, conspiracy, cover-ups, but this was something different. This was arson in the making. The intent was clear as day on that footage. She'd approached the base of the unfinished barn, crouched low, looked around nervously. She didn't act like someone checking a community concern. She acted like a criminal. I immediately called the sheriff. By the time they arrived, she was long gone, but I handed over the footage, time-stamped, and tagged. I made 2 more copies, one for my lawyer and one for the media, if it came to that. The deputy, a man named Carlton with a tired drawl and years of Karen fatigue etched into his face, sighed deep as he slid the USB drive into his pocket. "We've had complaints about her for years," he muttered. "But this ain't just HOA games anymore." He promised they'd follow up, but I knew better than to count on justice moving fast, especially when Karen had roots in every dusty pocket of the town's bureaucracy. So I kept building, kept digging in. By the end of the week, the frame was up. The sculpture of Pepper arrived from the fabricator in Colorado, a magnificent piece of art, cold and strong and full of motion, like he'd leap off his steel hooves if you blinked. I installed it myself, right above the main doorway, and right up under it, in letters cut from iron, "Trust is earned and never forgotten." Karen saw it the next morning. I know because the footage caught her again, this time standing at the edge of her lawn in a house robe, frozen, staring at the sign, for 15 full minutes. I waited for the next move, and sure enough it came. This time, it wasn't stealth. It was paper. She filed a civil suit. Defamation, harassment, emotional distress, all because I had dared to memorialize what she tried to erase. I met with my attorney that afternoon, showed him the footage, the forged HOA documents, the county records. He laughed, actually laughed, when he saw the filing. "This is going to backfire," he said, "and hard. We countersued immediately. Trespass, intent to destroy property, forgery, filing false legal documents under HOA authority." The barn wasn't even finished yet. But it was already a battleground. The community noticed, first in whispers, then in conversations at the feed store, the diner, the Saturday farmers market, and slowly people started showing up. Neighbors I barely knew, old ranchers, younger couples, even some of the more decent HOA members who'd stayed quiet for too long. They walked my fence line, looked at the barn, took off their hats in front of Pepper's sculpture. Some left flowers. One left a laminated photo of their daughter riding a miniature horse, said it changed her life. Word spread, and with it, so did the truth. Karen wasn't just losing control. She was becoming a cautionary tale, but I could feel it in my bones. She wasn't going to let this end in court papers or social disgrace. There was still something coming, something worse. And I was going to be ready, because I had built this land to last. Now I was building it to defend. It was just past 2 a.m. when the wind changed, not the weather, though the sky was heavy with storm clouds, but something else, a feeling. That hum in the air before something goes wrong. Every rancher knows it. The animals go still, the birds go silent, and you feel it behind your ribs before it shows itself. Was awake already, pacing the upper hallway with a flashlight in one hand and a thermos of bitter black coffee in the other. The cameras hadn't caught movement yet, but the silence outside, it was too thick, not natural. Then I saw it, on the far west camera, a shape, not walking, crawling, through the ditch that ran along the base of the field. Covered head to toe in dark fabric, even the face masked. Whoever it was, they were carrying something, long, heavy, wrapped in cloth. I zoomed in, adjusted the brightness, and my gut dropped. It was a rifle. She was escalating. Again, I didn't call the sheriff this time. I grabbed my boots, my coat, loaded my shotgun, not with buckshot this time, but with beanbags and salt rounds. Legal for home defense, loud enough to make a point, painful enough to discourage a second visit. By the time I got to the field, the figure was creeping along the outer edge of the barn's framework, too far from the cameras now. Thought she was smart. She didn't know I had added trail sensors, silent ones beneath the soft soil, just beneath where the horses used to run. I moved quick, sticking to the shadows. I flanked her on the east side, boots silent in the wet grass, the cold metal of the shotgun snug in my grip. When I was close enough to see her breath fogging up the edge of the mask, I stepped out. "Drop it, now." She spun quick, clumsy, and I was right. Karen, her eyes were wide, wild, and in her hands, wrapped in a canvas sleeve, wasn't just a rifle. It was mine. From the locked rack in my workshop, she'd broken in, stolen it, and now she was here, on my land, armed and hunting again. But I didn't flinch, didn't shout, just leveled the shotgun and gave her one more chance. "Drop it, or I swear to God you'll wish you had." She hesitated, almost like she didn't believe I'd pull the trigger, so I fired. The beanbag hit center mass, knocking her flat into the mud. The rifle clattered beside her. She screamed, a shrill, shocked, ragged sound that echoed off the steel frame of the barn and rolled across the hills. I stepped forward and kicked the rifle out of reach. "Don't ever come back here," I said, standing over her. "You're done, Karen." She looked up at me, eyes full of hate. Not fear, not even shame, just that same rage, the kind that comes from a person who can't stand the idea of losing control, but she had lost it. And I had the footage, the audio, the prints on the stolen weapon, the forced entry marks on the workshop door. When the deputies came this time, I didn't have to say much. They cuffed her right there in the mud, read her rights as the wind started to howl, and the first drops of rain began to fall. She didn't speak, didn't struggle. But as they drove away, I stood at the edge of the pasture, shotgun still in hand, and watched her silhouette vanish through the rear window of the cruiser. The barn stood. Behind me, framed against the storm like a monument, not just for Pepper, but for every battle I never should have had to fight. And I knew it wasn't over. People like Karen didn't just disappear. They regrouped. They waited. But so did I. And next time, wouldn't just be ready. I'd be waiting. The storm rolled in with a vengeance. By the time dawn crept across the soaked horizon, the land looked like a battlefield. Mud everywhere, the air heavy, not just with rain, but with something deeper. Finality. The kind that settles when a line's been crossed too many times and there's no going back. Karen was in custody, charged, booked, and the sheriff's department had already issued a temporary protective order on my behalf. But even as I stood at the window, watching water spill from the barn's gutterless frame, I knew she wasn't done, not really, because people like her, they didn't stop at defeat. They went underground, quiet, strategic. They poisoned from the shadows, and sure enough, 3 days later, the first ripple hit. It came in the form of a letter, not from Karen herself, but from a firm out of town. A lawyer, high-end, fancy letterhead, thick paper that smelled like cedar and money. They were representing interested community stakeholders who were deeply concerned about the divisive messaging of my barn and its detrimental impact on neighborhood unity. They wanted it torn down. They claimed it violated aesthetic covenants. They claimed it posed a potential emotional hazard. They even tried to argue that the steel sculpture of Pepper constituted a provocative political statement. I laughed, actually laughed, as I read it, and then I got to work. I pulled every permit, every code. I double-checked the agricultural exemption laws. I filed a counterclaim for harassment under rural landowner protections. I called a local news crew, yes, the one that had already started digging into Karen's past, and invited them for coffee and a walkthrough of the barn. By the following week, the story had aired. The headline, Local HOA Tyrant Arrested. After. Memorial Incident. Rancher fights back with iron and law. The footage of the barn aired right after that. They showed the halter, the sculpture, the wall of framed documents and photos, each one telling the full story from the first trespass to the night I fired. The town lit up. Calls came in. Support poured through the mailbox. Ranchers, activists, even a few former HOA members who'd quietly stepped down after the scandal broke. A retired judge sent me a signed copy of his own HOA reform proposal with a handwritten note, "Keep pushing. People like her have run wild for too long." But still, I didn't trust the quiet. Because it was too quiet. The lawsuit didn't vanish. It morphed, shifted. They filed again, this time citing property value interference. They tried to push a petition through the HOA to label my land unsuitable for mixed-use development, which would limit future building rights. I showed. Up at the next board meeting, with every legal document, map, and court motion I'd collected over the last 6 months. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just laid it all out. Then I handed them a manila envelope containing a freshly notarized notice. I was forming my own district under state law, large agricultural plots with sufficient distance from suburban. Developments could petition for administrative exemption and autonomy from homeowner associations. It was obscure, rarely used, but I had the land, the history, the evidence. And now I had the attention. It would take months, maybe a year. But if it passed, Karen's influence, her board, her rules, her poison, would be completely severed from My ranch, forever. No more drones, no more forged votes, no more backroom deals. I saw one of the newer board members grin when I left. A slow, relieved sort of smile, like someone watching a storm break. But I didn't smile because I still wasn't done. There was one more piece I hadn't placed yet. A final memorial. A message to everyone who'd watched from the sidelines or whispered behind fences while Karen tried to destroy what she couldn't control. And it was almost finished, set to be unveiled the night of the first clear sky, under a field of stars with the whole town invited. And when that moment came, even the shadows Karen left behind would have nowhere to hide.